Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. My life was saved by the Colorado lockdown. George Orwell said, "Early in life I had noticed that no event is ever correctly reported in a newspaper." Let me explain now how that relates to the topic of this video. My last glimpse of societal sanity was in Costa Rica during the beginning of March last year. I spent 10 days in Costa Rica photographing birds and butterflies during the first couple weeks of March 2020. It was a great experience surrounded by happy, healthy, sane people. But then I had to return back to Boulder, Colorado, where I was living at the time. I took this picture at the supermarket where I shopped in Boulder on March 14th, 2020. People in Boulder were buying everything they could, particularly toilet paper. And then on March 25th, 2020, 1 year ago today, the governor of Colorado announced that he was going to lock the state down. So after 25 years, I immediately fled the state and drove to Nebraska, where I took pictures of sandhill cranes for several weeks. Nebraska was great, and I never returned to Colorado other than to pack my stuff up and move to Wyoming. And this is what my supermarket in Boulder looked like this week. 10 people were killed there. A Syrian immigrant opened fire in the supermarket, killing lots of people. There's a pretty good chance I would have been in the supermarket that afternoon if the Colorado governor had not convinced me to flee the state because of his lockdown. So the Colorado lockdown literally may have saved my life. A few weeks ago, the Kamala Harris-Joe Biden administration bombed Syria for the first time in 4 years. I would imagine that this made Syrian immigrants quite angry at the United States. Democrats didn't like the 4 years of peace and prosperity under President Trump, so they went back to the old Joe Biden, Barack Obama bombing regime in Syria. President Kamala Harris seems to believe that bombing Syria is important. And after the shooting this week, Kamala Harris' niece immediately got on Twitter, blamed the shooting on white men, and said they're the greatest terrorist threat to our country. It didn't occur to her, apparently, that the shooter might have been angry about her aunt bombing his country. Deep staters seem to believe that bombing other countries is nice, but when other countries attack us, that's terrorism. Also interesting is that under the Kamala Harris administration, apparently it's okay to launch racist and sexist attacks against white men on Twitter. Had she used the words black women instead of white men, it probably would have been investigated as a hate crime. Then the president's niece deleted that tweet and said, "I made an assumption based on his being taken into custody alive and the fact that the majority of mass shootings in the U.S. are carried out by white men." So yet another racist and sexist attack by the president's niece. But besides being racist and sexist, she was also incorrect. According to the New York Times and the FBI, blacks are 6 times as likely as whites to be the perpetrators of mass shootings. But Democrats have of course ignored this because they couldn't use it for political gain. The number of mass shootings in the United States dropped to a 15-year low last year under President Trump. But during the first 3 months of this year under President Harris, the number of mass shootings has skyrocketed. Kamala Harris and the press spent most of last year actively promoting violence in American cities. They called the violence mostly peaceful and saw it as a way to gain political advantage. When white people get shot, like in Boulder this week, Democrats get very upset, but at the same time they ignore about 10 people getting shot every single day in Chicago last year. And the reason they ignored the more than 3,000 shootings in Chicago last year is because most of the shooters and most of the victims are blacks. Malcolm X said during the 1960s that white liberals are the worst enemies to America and the worst enemies to the black man, and that's still true today. In order to divert attention from the many things Democrats are doing wrong, the press and social media have started talking a lot about bigotry against Asian Americans. The New York Times asked this week, "Asian Americans are being attacked. Why are hate crime charges so rare?" The New York Times said, "On a cold evening last month, a Chinese man was walking home near Manhattan's Chinatown neighborhood when a stranger suddenly ran up behind him and plunged a knife into his back. For many Asian Americans, the stabbing was horrifying but not surprising. It's widely seen as just the latest example of racially targeted violence against Asians." But it's pretty easy to answer the New York Times question. The reason why these aren't being charged as hate crimes is because the perpetrators are mostly black. I was living near Baltimore during the 2015 riots, and most of the businesses which were burned or looted were owned by Koreans. White liberal Democrats are determined to blame violence on white men because they feel they can use it for political gain. If white liberal Democrats told the truth that it was their policies which were causing most of the problems in America, they wouldn't win very many elections. Besides the Democrats bombing Syria and their race baiting, their insane climate policies have caused energy prices to skyrocket. High energy prices are the most regressive tax of all, which hit the poor and the middle class hardest. Last year this week I paid $1.69 per gallon for gas, and this week I paid $3. The Kamala-Harris administration has only been in the White House for 2 months, and they're destroying America at a spectacular rate. They spent much of last year screaming about President Trump locking immigrant children in cages, and now NBC News reports that the Harris administration has a record number of immigrant children locked up in cages. Let's take a look now at what Malcolm X said 55 years ago. Kamala Harris' niece wants people to believe that white men are the greatest terrorist threat to our country, but Malcolm X said it was white liberals who were the problem.
That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere. He's the most deceitful. He's like a fox, and a fox is always more dangerous in the forest than the wolf. You can see the wolf coming. You know what he's up to, but the fox will fool you. He comes at you with his mouth shaped in such a way that even though you see his teeth, you think he's smiling, and you take him for a friend.
There are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chop in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro.
On the other hand, I think one could point to a large number of whites who have struggled for civil rights, for equality, and have got little or nothing out of it, other than quite a few bruises.
Give me an example.
Well, the large number of white students who have gone into the South, for example, working for SNCC and other organizations.
Not working for SNCC or other organizations, but working for the white political machines who benefit by the voting efforts of Negroes.
Okay. Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
Nothing that's going on with the Kamala-Harris administration makes any sense, and if you're wondering why I keep calling it the Kamala-Harris administration, well, here's why.
So thank you, Mr. President, for your confidence.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you for willing to do it. Now we're going to get down to business here, and Ron, who am I turning this over to?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. I think it's time for the press, our friends in the press to leave, though. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Mr. President, how are you going to visit the children in the border facility? Are you going to visit the border?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
This is not a presidency, this is elder abuse. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on this insanity for the past 13 years. You can visit him and Curie on the web at realclimatescience.com.